Welcome to SB Talks. Today is Monday, June 3rd, and I am joined by Stanford Brown Investment Committee member and former Reserve Bank Governor Ian Macfarlane to run the rule over monetary policy, inflation and the outlook for Australia and beyond. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you very much, Vincent.
Now, Ian, let's start by setting out where we find ourselves on the inflation front today, please.
Right, well, in order to answer that, I'm going to have to quote a few figures. I hope not too many, and I'll try and keep it simple.
That's okay. I'm sure most of the listeners would have figured that they were in for that.
Yeah. Well, the most widely recognised measure of inflation in all countries is just the plain vanilla CPI over the last 12 months. So, for example, April 2024 over April 2023. If you do that for the US, you get a figure of 3.4%. If you do that for Australia, you get a figure of 3.9%. Now, in Australia's case, we don't tend to use the monthly figures, we tend to use quarterly figures.
Yeah.
So what you'll probably see quoted is the March quarter of 2024 over the March quarter of 2023. Which is 3.6%.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing you'll see quoted is measures of core or underlying inflation. In other words, you take out the very volatile items, particularly energy and food, and you look at what the other 80% is doing.
To theoretically get your trend.
Yeah. I prefer to use the term underlying, but
yeah.
And if you do that, you get slightly higher. For the US, you get 3.6%. And if you do that for core, in Australia, you get about 4%.
Yeah.
Now, of course, these figures are a lot better than they were a year ago.
As in this time last year, looking backwards for 12
looking
months.
Backwards, there's definitely been an improvement. But they're still running well above the central bank's inflation targets, and the inflation target for the US is 2, and implicitly for Australia it's 2.5.
And I guess with that inflation sort of holding stickier at a higher level, do you see that as a problem, or do you think the broader trend is down?
Well, I think in order to answer that, you've got to stop using the 12 months ended growth rate.
Yeah.
Because that doesn't tell you what's happened within the last 12 months. It doesn't tell you whether, for example, the last 6 months was better than the previous 6 months. So you've got to move on to looking at actual monthly inflation. In other words, April over March, March over February, etc.
Yeah.
And if you do that, it's less reassuring than looking at the previous figures I gave you. For the US, for example, in the last quarter of last year, when things were looking really good, the inflation rate was annualised was 2%.
Yes.
But in the 4 months so far of this year, it's annualised at 4.2%. And for Australia, the picture is somewhat similar. The core inflation in the last quarter of last year was 2.2% annualised, and now it's 4.4%. So what that means is really that I think the readings we got for the last quarter of last year were a bit flattering. And I think the readings we're getting now for the first 4 months of this year are a truer indication of where inflation is.
That's a very important point, because markets got very excited late last year in terms of expectations of rate cuts. Based on those inflation numbers, we've seen higher, and let's say more concerning inflation numbers through the first 4 months of this year, as you articulate. So your view is they are probably a truer picture than what we saw in late 2023.
That's right. That's right. I think just going back for a moment, what we've been through is a situation where most of the prices, 80% of the prices in CPI, are just underlying things that move slowly, but there was a 20% bit, which was what was called transitory, which coming out of COVID, there were the shortage of supply, and these prices shot up. And whilst they were shooting up, they were pushing up the monthly CPIs above the underlying measure.
Yeah.
But when they turned around, which they have, and gone back to where they started, we've had a series of negatives coming from these transitory items, and that was pushing down the monthly CPIs, making them look better than they really were.
Right.
Now, that's been washed out of the system now. And what we're looking at, I think, is a much more realistic measure of where inflation seems to have settled.
So you're describing a picture there where we had the, let's call it artificial for want of a better word, inflationary aspect of the transitory things working through on the front end, and then perhaps an artificial depression of the true inflation figure by the removal on the back end.
Yeah.
And now we're into a position where I guess the figures that we are seeing in the last 4 months begin to show the truer challenge that the governments and reserve banks have on their hands.
Yeah, I think that's the situation. I think what we had in the last quarter of last year was a sort of a false dawn, and that's behind us now.
So what's your take on where true inflation numbers are running at, both both US and domestically?
Yeah, right. Well, my summary would be that in the US it's somewhere between 3 and 4, and in Australia it's somewhere between 3.5 and 4.5.
Yeah, but not you're not indicating a scenario where inflation is picking back up per se. It's just that the true downward trend has not quite been as sharp as people had previously thought.
Right. It's not accelerating, no.
Yeah.
No.
I might step across to monetary policy if I can. Once you digest that information, what are the implications for policy settings in your opinion?
Well, obviously inflation is the biggest single indicator of central bank monetary policy action. It's not the only figure they look at, but it is the most important. And the market, during that false dawn, developed a very optimistic view of where inflation was going, and so they developed a very optimistic view of what central banks would do with their interest rates.
Markets started to price in a fairly giddy level of rate cuts for 2024.
Well, it was really quite surprising. I think at its most optimistic, which would probably be in about January this year, in the US they were pricing in 7 1/4 point cuts in the course of 2024. Now, this is not the first time, of course. Markets have been sort of consistently optimistic, and in 2022, 2023 and 2024, they have priced in cuts in central bank interest rates. Not immediate, but within a year that rates will be coming down again. And each time they've been wrong.
Reality has told a different story.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the US, as I said, at the beginning of this year, the market was pricing in 7 cuts. Now they've reduced that to 1. And in Australia, they were pricing in a couple in 2024, and now they've gone. They're not priced in there anymore. So reality has sort of taken over. Some would say the higher for longer school got it right, and the optimists got it wrong.
Well, I guess a couple of questions that step out of that. So one is, in terms of what the market's pricing in right now, do you think it's broadly getting back in line with what it should be? Do you feel, are the markets possibly still a bit too optimistic or pessimistic? What's your take?
Well, they're certainly much closer to reality than they have been in the previous years. recent years. But the interesting bit is, why are they sitting on the edge of their seat, always expecting a change? Why are they always looking at changes in monetary policy, so you have to keep having changes?
Yeah.
Why don't they, on the other hand, look at the level? So let's discuss that for Australia. The level of the Reserve Bank's cash rate is 4.35%. So you have to ask yourself, is that a high level? Or is that an average level? Or the other way of asking it, is that possibly the right level?
Does the Reserve Bank deem this as a restrictive setting or
Well,
a normal setting?
Well, I think they see it as the right setting, otherwise they'd have a different setting. And I see it as sort of roughly the right setting too. Now, if you look at it in terms of levels, you have to ask yourself, is it high? I mean, I've seen people talking about high interest rates, but is it really high? Well, first of all, compare it to our historical experience. No, it's not very high. In my 10 years as governor, it averaged 5.2% over a whole 10-year period.
Yeah.
And my successor, it averaged 3.9% over his 10-year period. So 4.35 is not very high. And if I had made the comparison to earlier periods like the 1980s and the 1970s,
well,
4.5.
it's a totally different sphere altogether.
4.35 would look very low.
So I guess people's memories become shorter, and it only looks high when you look back a decade or so, and not very much when you look any further.
Right. So that's the first comparison, which it tells you that 4.35 is not really very high. The second comparison is to compare it to our peer countries. And again, I mean, in the US and New Zealand, the equivalent rate is 5.5%.
Yeah.
In Canada and the UK, it's 5.25%. So our 4.35 does not look at all high by world standards.
Can I just ask one question on that? Do you feel that, because Australia faced much the same inflation challenges as other parts of the world, I respect every region is a little bit different, but is the Reserve Bank a tad more cautious in how high they go with rates because of the level of household debt in Australia? I appreciate that's speculating perhaps.
Yeah. I don't think that's the case. I think the case is they started to move rates up slower. They were later, to start.
Later to start, and probably not quite as aggressive.
And by the time we hit that lull, everyone stopped raising rates, and so did the Reserve Bank. But it hadn't gotten
as far
as the others, would be my guess. And the third measure, comparative measure, where you ask yourself whether 4.35 is high or low, is compared to the rate of inflation. Well, I've characterised the rate of inflation as about 4%. So 4.35% interest rate and 4% inflation rate, barely positive in real terms. So I think whichever way you look at it, we're not starting from a high level of interest rates. So
as we sit today.
There's no urgency
to cut.
Reducing it. There have been periods where we've started from very high levels, but this is not one of them. We're starting from something which is sort of a medium, or some would say less than medium, starting point.
And the other way you start to think about it is, what impact is that rate having on the economy? Is it having a contractionary impact? Obviously, we've had to shoot from an artificially low level of 0 to up to over 4 in a relatively short period of time. So naturally, that's going to be contractionary in some way, is it not?
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, if you go from 0 to 4 in the space of about 12 months, that is a big change. 4 percentage points in about a year, or a little over a year, is a big change. And so that's bound to have effects, bound to have contractionary effects. But let's remember, it's not the 4 that's unusual, it was the 0 that was unusual.
100%, yes.
And it is having some contractionary effects, particularly on consumption. And of course consumption is the biggest component of GDP, and so as a result GDP has grown very slowly and has not even kept up with population
Yeah,
growth,
so we've got
which
this
is
per
unusual.
capita recession that we've talked about previously on this podcast.
So, and you can see the weakness, I think, in consumption. You can see it from the official retail sales monthly figures. You can see it from the quarterly figures on consumption in the national accounts. And I think you can see it looking around you.
You can see it in part of reporting season where certain companies that are more exposed to consumer, certainly consumer discretionary,
you can see it there. You can see it there. You can also see it in statements, for example, from Woolies and Coles, where they say that their customers are tending to move more and more towards home brand, and cheaper cuts of meat, and so you can definitely see that it has had an effect. But the intriguing thing is, it's had very little effect on the most important indicator, which is the rate of unemployment, which at 4.1% is really quite low by historical standards. Despite the big increase in population flooding in, they've found jobs. And so employment's risen by 2.8% over the last year, and that's actually a strong number for employment. And so at the moment, the most important indicator of the public's reaction to what's happening in the economy, most important indicator is still looking okay. Although there are other parts of the economy which definitely are weak. But there are also other things that are sort of holding it up, like that population growth, like the strength in the resource sector. So
there's definitely no doubt that we've got inequality across the economy. There's certainly pockets of weakness in certain sectors. There's probably very significant pockets of financial stress in certain aspects of the household world that is out there.
Well, it's related to age too, as you probably know. Most of your
and household debt.
Most of your clients are probably in the lucky quarter. But young people with
significant borrowings.
Really got getting squeezed.
Can I ask you a question then, as a central banker and setting policy settings? How do you grapple with that when you know that adjustments in your settings are going to have quite a profound impact on, I don't want to say a narrow group, it would be a substantial component of the population, and may or may not actually achieve the inflationary outcome that you want?
Well, the only thing you can work to is the average. Now, we were talking about different age groups. In my time, I used to get criticised for regional differences. At one stage, people were saying, "Oh, you're only making monetary policy for Sydney."
Right.
Or often it's only making monetary policy for the cities, and you're not making it for the regional areas. So there's always going to be differences.
There's always going to be tensions in the system.
Yeah, there's always going to be some parts that are growing above average and some parts growing below average. And there's not much you can do about that other than just concentrate on the average.
Let's talk, if we can, a little about the potential implications, if any, of the most recent federal budget and how that might flow through. So, for example, some of the announced subsidies on things like the prices of electricity. How, obviously, that has a flow-through impact on inflationary readings. How much will that influence the Reserve Bank's thinking, or should it?
It shouldn't influence it at all, and I don't think it will, because government changes to either taxes or subsidies do not affect the underlying rate of inflation. They affect the measured rate in the quarter that they occur.
As a temporary impact.
Yeah, and unless they double up and do it again next year and again the year after. For example, these subsidies, it's not just good enough to keep the subsidies in place, because that won't have any effect on inflation next year. You would have to have another.
You'd have to double the subsidy next year.
You have to double the subsidy and then double. So it's a one-off thing that affects the headline CPI for a short period. And so central banks should look straight through it, and I'm sure the Reserve Bank will, and not be influenced by it. I had a very big experience with this in my time, because when the GST was introduced in June of July 2000.
The mother of all inflationary injections into the numbers.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it lifted the 12 months ended CPI from 3.1% to 6.1% in one quarter.
But you knew it was coming.
In other words, 3 percentage points, effectively double the rate of inflation. And some people thought, well, this is an alarming rate of inflation, you've got to do something about it. But we looked through it, and our conclusion was it did not affect the underlying rate of inflation. So we didn't tighten monetary policy, and eventually, in a year's time, that 4 quarters ended rate of inflation dropped back down again to 2.5%, and it stayed lower thereafter. And so that is the guide to what central banks should do if the CPI is artificially impacted by government tax or subsidy policies.
A very comprehensive overview. Thank you very much again, Ian. A clear message I'm hearing there in terms of do not expect any rate cuts anytime soon. Probably likely monetary policy to be relatively consistent for the foreseeable future. Dare I say, a message that you've been clearly articulating for some time, and now the markets are probably moving more in line with your views. So thank you very much, Ian, and thank you to all our listeners.